Good day. Today I'm going to cover what I suspect will be my last video on the recently ended battle of Lysychansk and of course the capture by the Russians of the entire Severodonetsk Lysychansk conurbation, and with it in effect their capture of the entirety of Lugansk region. We've had a very interesting discussion, a televised report by General Shoigu, who is the Russian defense minister, to President Putin, which summarizes the operation. And I'm going to go through it and pass it, and I'm going to discuss a few points that it raises. I'm also going to say a few other things about the general state of the conflict after I've done this. So briefly, this is what General Shoigu said to Putin yesterday, July the 4th, in a meeting which we learned took place in the Kremlin, and there's actually a photograph of the two men. The Kremlin has provided a photograph of the two men speaking to each other. But anyway, this is what Shoigu said to Putin. Since June 19th, formations and units of the Center Group under the command of Colonel General Alexander Lapin, in cooperation with units of the 2nd People's Militia Corps of the Lugansk People's Republic, and supported by the Southern Group of Forces led by Army General Sergei Surovikin, have successfully carried out an offensive operation to liberate the Lugansk People's Republic. Within 2 weeks, they encircled and destroyed the groups in the Gorskoye Cauldron around Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. 25 localities have been taken under control, the largest of which are Severodonetsk, Zolotoye, Gorskoye, and Volcheyarovka. The operation ended yesterday with the liberation of Lysychansk, one of the largest towns in the Lugansk People's Republic. A total of 670 square kilometers of territory were taken under control during the active offensive. The total losses of the Ukrainian armed forces amounted to 5,469 personnel, including 2,218 killed and 3,251 wounded, 196 tanks and other armoured vehicles, 12 aircraft, 1 helicopter, 69 drones, 6 long-range surface-to-air missile systems, 97 multiple rocket launchers, 166 field and mortar artillery pieces, and 216 vehicles of various purposes. When retreating from Lysychansk, the enemy abandoned 39 tanks and other armoured vehicles, 11 guns and mortars, 48 javelins and law anti-tank missile systems, 18 Stinger systems, and 3 unmanned aerial vehicles. Today, the demining of the city of Lysychansk and its environs is underway, as is the delivery of humanitarian cargo, as well as the provision of medical assistance to civilians. The Russian armed forces are continuing the special military operation. And then Putin responded. As you know, Colonel General Alexander Lapin and Army General Sergei Surovikin also reported to me today on the progress in fulfilling their tasks and presented their proposals for the development of offensive operations. Both the Defense Ministry and the General Staff are considering the proposals of the field commanders. The units that took place in active combat operations and achieved success and victories in the Lugansk direction, of course, should rest and rebuild their combat capabilities. Other military formations, including the East Group and the West Group, must carry out their tasks according to the previously approved plans, according to the single scheme, and I hope that everything will happen in their directions in the same way as it happened in Lugansk. I agree with your proposal to award General Lapin and Deputy Commander of the 8th Army of the Southern Military District, Major General Abachev, the title of Hero of Russia. The corresponding presidential executive order will be signed today. I would also ask you to recommend for state decorations all military personnel who distinguish themselves in the course of these combat operations. Based on your daily reports, I know that the Russian army has many such brave professional soldiers, daring in a good way warriors, and they should all be honoured with corresponding state decorations of their motherland. My congratulations and words of gratitude also go to the soldiers of the 2nd Army Corps of the Lugansk People's Republic militia. I know that they worked actively and competently too, and showed courage and heroism in the truest sense of the word when liberating their native land. I congratulate all of you and wish you further success. So that's what Shoigu said to Putin. Now let's just unpack what he said. First of all, note that Shoigu dates the start of offensive operations, or at least the active phase of offensive operations, to June 19th, and says that the entire operation took just 2 weeks. Now that's an interesting fact, because fighting in Severodonetsk actually began in late May, and Severodonetsk was partly captured, or largely captured, by the middle of June. So clearly there have been 2 phases to this operation. One which began in May for the capture of Severodonetsk, and one which began on the 19th of June, and which has ended in the capture of Lysychansk and in this entire area of Lugansk region. Now, what I find a little interesting about this is that Severodonetsk itself came under full Russian control on 25th June. So it seems that the Russians, anticipating the swift collapse of Severodonetsk, went ahead and started offensive operations, as they put it, to capture the remainder of Lugansk region, whilst there were still Ukrainian troops holding out, not so much in Severodonetsk itself, but in the Azot chemical works. So that's, I think, a curious fact, perhaps not interesting important in itself, but it does give us a sense of how fluid operations are. The Russians didn't wait for the end of the battle in Severodonetsk. They didn't wait for the fall of the Azot chemical factory. They decided to launch their offensive before, and they carried out that offensive, and they carried it out with complete success. And we learned that the 2 generals involved, Lapin and Surovikin. Lapin was clearly the more the general who was carrying out the major battles in Lysychansk. Lapin and Surovikin are reporting directly to Putin. So Putin is being informed of what is going on by the field commanders, and we learned that they have actually told Putin that that they presented their proposals for the development of offensive operations. So the 2 generals, Lapin and Surovikin, not only report to Putin, they also provide him with proposals and suggestions as to how things should be progressed further. So we see that Putin is very well informed about what is going on in Donbass and in the fighting in Ukraine. Field commanders report to him. We don't know how regularly this happens, but they reported to him. Lapin and Surovikin reported to him on the 4th of July before he spoke to Shoigu. And importantly, Putin has gone out of his way to mention the fact. And we also see that Putin, after these discussions with Shoigu, with Surovikin, with Lapin, and after confirming to us that the Defense Ministry and the General Staff are in the process of considering the proposals of the field commanders, that Putin has instructed that the troops who took part in the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and in that surrounding area should rest and build up their combat capabilities. So they're not going to be sent straight back into battle again. The battle, however, is going to continue. It's going to be taken further by other formations, and Putin spoke about other military formations, including the East Group and the West Group, must carry out their tasks according to the previously approved plans, according to the single scheme. And I hope everything will happen in the directions in the same way as it has happened in Lugansk. Now, the military summary channel, the person who does that, I believe he's from Belarus, the Belarusian commentator who provides us with the information from the military summary channel, discussed the ongoing fighting in the town of Siversk, around the town of Siversk, which is in northern Donetsk region, and he explained why he thought that the operational pause with respect to the troops, the Russian troops and allied troops who captured Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, will be short, and that in fact the offensive will continue, and that offensive is now going to be directed at Siversk and will capture Siversk probably within a couple of days. Now, I'm not going to second guess about timetables. I don't have the expertise to do so. But you can see that Putin is saying things that correspond with that analysis. The troops who carried out the capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk are going to rest, but other troops from the East Group and the West Group will continue the offensive. And the military summary channel and other sources, by the way, have suggested that Lysychansk itself is going to be attacked from multiple directions, with Russian forces advancing from the north towards Lysychansk. The Russians are already located north of Lysychansk. They've already, Siversk, north from the north. They're going to advance on Siversk from the north. They've already crossed the Siversky Donetsk River in a number of places, and that Siversk itself is going to be invested before very long. It's going to be surrounded before very long. And the situation looks apparently very precarious for the Ukrainians in Siversk, even though they've sent reinforcements apparently to Siversk, and some suggestions that they see Siversk as a major point for defense again, and they're going to try and stop or slow down this Russian offensive there. But there have now been various reports, including from the military summary channel, but I've seen them in other places, but that there are reports that the Ukrainian command, the military command, are telling Zelensky and his officials that Siversk is undefendable and that it is certain to fall, and that they're already apparently pressing for a withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Siversk, and that some kind of withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Siversk may be underway. And now that the issue of withdrawal has been brought up, I'm going to just touch on the Ukrainian losses that General Shoigu reported about to Putin. And I'm going to quote him again. The total losses of the Ukrainian armed forces amounted to 5,469 personnel, including 218 killed and 3,251 wounded. Note that there is no reference here to any Ukrainian soldiers being captured. Now that's interesting, and one wonders exactly what has happened here. These are, let's be very clear about this, extremely heavy losses. 5,469 soldiers killed or wounded. But what about prisoners? Shoigu doesn't actually mention prisoners. And it suggests either that the Russians haven't yet fully counted their prisoners, or alternatively that a large number of Ukrainian troops managed to escape Lysychansk and these two particular cauldrons. So if the Russian objective was to capture large numbers of Ukrainian prisoners, as they did in Mariupol when the Azovstal steelworks fell, that hasn't quite happened. It seems that most of the Ukrainian troops have either escaped, or alternatively, perhaps the total bag of prisoners has not yet been fully accounted for, because there are still Ukrainian troops both east of the Siversk Donetsk River, around Severodonetsk, and in the area that the Russians have just captured in and around Lysychansk, including apparently in southern Lysychansk itself. Now, I'm going to suggest that it's probably a combination of the two. Some Ukrainian soldiers did indeed manage to escape to Ukrainian lines, to Siversk to be precise, but it does seem as if an awful lot of others have been left behind to fend for themselves, and as if the Russians are in the process of rounding them up, both in the area east of the Siversk Donetsk River, in the area in and around Severodonetsk, and also in the newly captured area west of the Siversk Donetsk River, in and around Lysychansk, and also in and around the Gorskoye cauldron, the Gorskoye Zolotoye area. So it's possible that the total bag of prisoners has not yet been counted and will be higher. And perhaps also the Russians have political reasons for holding back on the total number of prisoners, perhaps because the eventual plan is to exchange some of them for their own troops who have been captured by the Ukrainians. There are far fewer of those, it must be said, but there are some, and no doubt the Russians still want to exchange on a one-for-one basis some of these troops for the Ukrainian troops that they've captured in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and in other places there. Note also that the Ukrainians clearly did leave most of their heavy equipment behind. 196 tanks and other armored vehicles, and also 6 long-range surface-to-air missiles apparently were destroyed, and they abandoned behind them. 97 multiple rocket launchers were destroyed. 166 field guns were and mortars were also destroyed, and 216 vehicles. And that the Ukrainians abandoned 39 tanks and other armored vehicles, 11 guns and mortars, and a large number of anti-tank and anti-aircraft missile systems, and 3 drones. All of those were left behind in Lysychansk and in this area. So the Ukrainians have suffered very heavy losses. They've lost large numbers of men, large amount of equipment. And always remember, this is only one part of the total area of the battle, and Shoigu is reporting only about Ukrainian losses. in Lysychansk and in the Gorskoy Cauldron. He is not reporting about the earlier losses the Ukrainians suffered in Severodonetsk. So it's probably large numbers of troops have been lost. A large amount of equipment has been lost by Ukraine. And last but not least, we see that two Russian generals, General Lapin and General Abachev, Major General Abachev, have both been decorated and have been given Russia's highest military award, which is Hero of Russia. General Abachev, by the way, or to give him his full name, Major General Ezedula Abachev, is the commander of the Chechen forces who were involved in the operation to capture Lysychansk. So I think that's quite an interesting summary, and it gives us some idea of exactly what was going on and how the Russians conducted operations. Clearly, the operation to storm Lysychansk and the Gorskoy Cauldron began even before Severodonetsk was completely cleared, and it seems that the battle to capture Siversk is already underway, with advances, as I said, from the northern, from the Russian forces in the north towards Siversk, and presumably these are the groups of forces that Putin was referring to. And it seems that we have overlapping units being used. So General Surovikin seems to have been in charge of the troops who captured Severodonetsk, and they're now largely resting. And General Lapin and his troops then went on to capture Lysychansk. And now a third grouping of troops is advancing on Siversk. And we see how the Russians are able to deploy different troops to carry out different tasks, thereby giving each of their groups of forces time to rest and recover. So it's not continuous combat. They're able to maneuver different units to carry out different tasks. When that task is done, they rest, they reconstitute themselves, and in the meantime, the battle is carried on by other units. Or so at least it seems to me. That's how I read this particular report from Shoigu and Putin's responses. So Russian troops are not engaged in continuous fighting and worn down in that sort of way. And the Russians don't need to constantly reinforce troops who are engaged in offensive operations. The troops that engage in those operations, they carry them out, then they stop, then they stop, they're withdrawn to rest and recover, and the offensive is carried out by other troops. It's not a constant churn of more and more people being sent into one particular battle and more people dying and being lost in the way that we see with Ukraine. It's a more, shall we say, methodical approach, and one which is possible because the Russians have the initiative in this war. Now, there is a few further points to make about this. This battle that we've seen, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, it's clearly part of one larger plan. Putin talks about a single scheme. So the Russians clearly are working in accordance with some overall strategy to, I suppose, to capture or liberate, if you prefer, the entirety of Donbass. So there's clearly an overall strategy. It's clearly run by the General Staff in Moscow. There's been some discussion about who the overall commander is. It seems to me that it's clear that the overall commander is none other than General Gerasimov, who is the chief of the General Staff. He, by the way, recently visited Russian troops in Donbass and obtained field reports from them. And I suspect that he does that on a fairly regular basis. So he's clearly the overall commander. But the field commanders, men like Surovikin and Lapin and Abachev, are given obviously a great deal of flexibility in the way in which they conduct operations, the particular operations that are assigned to them, and that they're able to report directly to Putin, and there's a constant sense of discussion between various elements of the Russian military and political leadership. It does give the impression to me, from a distance, of being a fairly unified and streamlined command system. That's my own interpretation of this. So what are we going to see? Putin said that there's an overall scheme. Siversk does seem to be the next part of the scheme. After Siversk, it'll no doubt be Bakhmut, which remains the main the main Ukrainian base here in northern Donbass. After Bakhmut, the main battle will start for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. The Russians have been edging ever closer towards both Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. They're within 7 kilometers of Slavyansk, and they're capturing more and more territory ever closer, not just to Slavyansk, but to Kramatorsk, and then the battle for these places will begin. And by the way, it seems to me that this also gives us a clear picture of some understanding of certain other aspects of the fighting. We've seen that there's been this major Russian grouping concentrated around ETHEREUM, which has been lying idle, or still, I don't think it's been idle. It's actually had to do quite a lot of fighting, but most of it has not been committed to the battle. And this, it seems to me, is consistent with this report from Putin and Shoigu, because you see that these troops around ETHEREUM are being held in reserve for the next big battle. So that could be the battle that will now start with Siversk and Bakhmut, that these troops will move south towards these two towns and capture them. And then maybe in conjunction, once they've captured Siversk, which is apparently not expected to be too difficult, and Bakhmut, which is apparently difficult to defend for all sorts of geographical reasons, topographical reasons, which I'm not going to go into. Maybe a part of this force will then close in on Slavyansk, whilst perhaps, conceivably, another Russian force or Russian-led force advancing from the east will close in on Kramatorsk. That's just possible. I'm not a strategist or a theorist, but anyway, that's how it all looks to me. Now, that's what the Russians have been saying. What have the Ukrainians been saying in response? Well, we've had a flood of comments from Zelensky and his officials about how this is only a temporary setback, about how they expect or intend to recapture Lugansk region, drive the Russians all the way back. I personally think this is all delusional. And I would say that just a few days ago, a short time ago, before Severodonetsk fell, Zelensky was saying that the entire war in Donbass hinged on Severodonetsk. That fell on the 25th of June. He's now lost Lysychansk. Ukraine has now lost Lysychansk. How does he reconcile his continued talk about victory with these claims about the decisive nature of the battle in Severodonetsk? I fail to see. Now, there's been two rather disturbing articles, at least disturbing for me. The first is one from Associated Press, which has interviewed a large number of Ukrainian soldiers who were involved in these battles in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And I'm not going to read the article, but I'm going to provide a link to it. But all I will say is it provides a picture of, well, one of these Ukrainian soldiers said that the battle, the fighting for the Ukrainians was hell. Now, the Ukrainian soldiers both say that both Severodonetsk and Lysychansk have been obliterated by the Russian artillery. This is simply not true. Severodonetsk, the city, was stormed by the Russians very fast. We've seen lots of photographs. The center of the city is largely intact. There's very little damage except in one area in the outskirts, the suburbs, near to the Azot chemical works, where some of the most intense fighting happened. And as for Lysychansk, it's essentially the same picture. There's been a certain amount of damage done, this time, interestingly, in the central areas of Lysychansk, around some of the government buildings. There's been suggestions from the Russians, which, by the way, we should treat very, very cautiously, that the Ukrainians themselves destroyed some of the administrative buildings in Lysychansk. I'm not sure that's true. I'm rather skeptical about that claim. But anyway, to move on, most of Lysychansk fell very fast without a fight and is largely intact, as are most of the industrial facilities around it. So this picture of an intense Ukrainian resistance, pitting down large numbers of Russian troops, inflicting heavy losses on the Russians, which we are reading about and being told about in the Western media and by the Ukrainians, it's simply, in my opinion, wrong. And I say it's wrong because I've seen a fair amount of photographic and video evidence, pictures from both of these cities, and they do not look particularly badly damaged, and of course they fell extremely quickly. Severodonetsk within about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if you include the chemical works. Lysychansk within 2 weeks, with the fighting in Lysychansk being actually even shorter than that. So these two cities were stormed very quickly by the Russians, one after the other, and they've been captured by the Russians, largely intact, and there's ample photographic and video evidence which I have seen which confirms that. So this narrative that this article in Associated Press repeats, and which has been circulating on the internet, that this was somehow Ukrainian victory because they caused the Russians very heavy attrition in this battle, that simply doesn't seem to me to be the case at all. And in fact, a militia commander, a Donbass militia commander, a man called Khodorkovsky, has even gone further. He has actually said that the number of troops, Russian and allied troops, that actually got involved in the fighting, both in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, was actually quite limited, that there weren't large numbers of troops committed by the Russians to these battles, that again, they were outnumbered by the Ukrainians, but that they were able to win these battles very fast because the Ukrainian defenses were not organized properly, and because obviously the immense superiority that the Russians possess in material, in armor, in guns, in all the kind of equipment and paraphernalia of war. Now that's Khodorkovsky. We can't be certain that what he's saying is true, but for what it's worth, I think it probably is true. Khodorkovsky has been one of the more, shall we say, maybe not objective, but at least realistic commentators about this war from the Russian side. And of course, he is actually a militia commander whose forces actually engage in the fighting in eastern Ukraine. By the way, he's a veteran. He was also very heavily involved in the fighting by the militia way back in 2014, when I can remember that he had a very difficult relationship with the leader of the Donbass militia, or at least the Donetsk militia at that time, who was an individual who is known in the Russian-speaking world by the name of Strelkov, though I should say that that's not his given name. There's suggestions that his name is something else. Girkin is the one that's mostly spoken about. He was a person who played a big role in the fighting in 2014. He's not involved in the fighting now, but Khodorkovsky is. Anyway, that's a piece of history. So Khodorkovsky, as I said, has given what I've found reasonably reliable and realistic accounts of things. And when he says that the number of troops that the Russians and their allied forces actually committed to these battles in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk was relatively small, I take his claims seriously, even if it's not been corroborated, obviously, by any third party. So that's where we are. It looks to me as if an offensive carried out over a period of 2 weeks by a well-organized Russian force, backed by heavy artillery, aircraft, as I said, all the paraphernalia of modern war, and able to achieve its objectives swiftly. I'm not going to say effortlessly, because that's not really an appropriate word to say in war. But anyway, they were able to achieve it without heavy losses, whilst inflicting significant losses on the Ukrainians. And coming back now to that Associated Press report, we see that the Ukrainians are not just talking about the fact that they experienced hell on earth in trying to defend these places, but again, there are complaints about the fact that they weren't properly equipped, that they weren't properly supported, and that they were simply comprehensively outmatched, and that some of them were thrown back into the battle even whilst they were still wounded. So it's a pretty harrowing picture that the Associated Press article provides from the Ukrainian side. Now, obviously, all the Ukrainian troops who have been interviewed are still serving, and they've obviously been carefully selected by the Ukrainian command, and all and every one of them says that, they're still committed to fighting, and that they will go on and achieve victory eventually over the Russians. I'm afraid I take all of that with a giant cascade of salt. I'm afraid I suspect that that's what they've been told to say, and of course that's what they're saying. Doesn't mean, of course, that they don't believe it, but I don't think that one should take it too seriously. And I think that President Zelensky's claims that all this territory is going to be recaptured, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, I think that is delusional. Now, that brings me to the next point, because all these points about Ukraine achieving some kind of strategic victory in Severodonetsk, about how they've worn down the Russians even further, how the Russians have only been able to capture these places after heavy losses, suffering heavy losses, have all these Ukrainian troops talking defiantly about taking the battle back against the Russians. And of course, all these comments by Ukrainian officials and President Zelensky himself saying essentially the same thing. All of this, it seems to me, is very much part of what is becoming increasingly the style from Ukraine of explaining away defeats. Well, perhaps that's not so surprising. Talking confidently about victory. Perhaps that's not so surprising. But also, it must be said, staging events to make it seem like there's this enormous sense of defiance on the part of the soldiers, and also that Ukraine is somehow achieving successes. And there was another event which took place the other day, which is similar, and which is also, for me, a good example of Ukraine focusing to a dangerous degree, in my opinion, on public relations instead of on actual battles. Now, this brings us back to that I find tiresome subject of Snakes Island, about which I've recently done a program, by the way, which is exclusive for locals. But anyway, I've discussed in various programs how, though the Russians have withdrawn from Snakes Island because this is a bare, small, uninhabited piece of rock without much cover, so that any troops based there would quickly run short of supplies and would be exposed to heavy artillery attacks, such as the Russians were experiencing over the last few weeks, how the Russians have withdrawn from Snakes Island for that reason. I've also said that the Ukrainians, if they were to try to reoccupy Snakes Island, would find themselves in the same position. If Ukraine tried to deploy troops to Snakes Island, it too would find it all but impossible to keep them supplied. It too would find that those troops were subjected to artillery attack, this time from the Russians, who are in a position to launch missile strikes on Snakes Island from Crimea, and artillery strikes and bombing raids on Snakes Island from using other forces, aircraft and warships and what have you. So Snakes Island is not recaptured by Ukraine. It is in what both the Russians and the Ukrainians call the grey zone, no man's land. Well, the Ukrainians pulled off a stunt which appeared to imply otherwise. Over the last couple of hours, I've been reading reports in all sorts of places about how the Ukrainian flag has been raised on Snakes Island. And that implies that Ukrainian troops have landed on the island, that they've hauled out the flag, that they're now back in control. And for a time, I also assumed that this must be true, and I did wonder what was happening and why the Russians had let it happen, and whether this might be connected with some complex negotiations that the Russians are currently undertaking with Turkey to allow grain ships to leave Odessa and that sort of thing. Well, it turns out that there are no Ukrainian troops on Snakes Island, and that the Ukrainian flag on Snakes Island has not been unfurled. It hasn't been raised on Snakes Island. It was dropped on the island by a Ukrainian helicopter. Now, that does seem to me a pointless thing to do. It's also a very manipulative thing to do. It creates or fosters an impression that Snakes Island is reoccupied by Ukraine, which at this point of the war, it is not. So why do it? Why pretend that you have done something? Why pretend you have recaptured territory when the reality is that you haven't? Well, Ukraine has been doing this in other places. It's been doing this in the southern region around Kherson, where the Ukrainians have repeatedly claimed that they're going on the offensive. They claim to have recaptured various settlements and villages and all those sort of things. Sometimes they do and hold them for a short time, and then they have to pull back. But I've gradually come round to the view that these Ukrainian offensives on Kherson are more a PR exercise, or have been up to now, more a PR exercise than anything else. And I think this is dangerous because it reinforces a misleading picture of the state of the war. And of course, in terms of the fighting in Kherson region, it's causing Ukraine to suffer losses, to capture territory, small areas of territory, which it then has to immediately retreat from. And I'm going to suggest that this is also ultimately true about the battles at Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. It never made any sense for Ukraine to try to hold on to these places. As I said, the Russians have been able to capture Severodonetsk and Lysychansk relatively quickly. at relatively low cost, whereas Ukraine, by contrast, has suffered very heavy losses and paid a very high cost trying to defend these places. It only makes sense to cling on to Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in this kind of way, as part again of a PR exercise, of a story, a narrative of Ukraine hanging on to its territory, fighting to the last bullet and the last man, forced eventually to retreat in the face of overwhelming numbers, but dealing out massive losses against the Russians, and that this is the narrative that is being promoted, and this is why this fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk was carried out in that kind of way. Well, I have two problems with this. Firstly, that seems to me to be fundamentally a false narrative. And it seems to me that if you're telling people, especially in war, things that are so completely not true, the danger is that ultimately what you will do is destroy your own credibility, and that will result in a very heavy price to pay when that eventually happens, as eventually it must. But the second is that the price that is being paid in terms of Ukrainian lives to sustain this narrative seems to me to be an exorbitant one. Let's come again to what Shoigu said to Putin. 5,469 Ukrainian personnel have been lost by the Ukrainian army. And he talks about 2,218 killed and 3,251 wounded. Now that figure of 3,251 is extraordinarily precise. One wonders how Shoigu is able to be so precise about it. With the dead, perhaps they've been counted on the battlefield, but with the wounded, how does he have that figure? Perhaps some of these wounded are captured too. And when he talks about losses, well, having men wounded in battle is a terrible thing, even if thankfully they're not dead. So all of this seems to be an extraordinarily high price to pay in order to sustain a narrative of Ukraine heroically battling on in Donbass, fighting for every part of its territory, dealing out enormous losses to the Russians, looking forward to the day when all this territory will be recaptured, preparing for this great counteroffensive, which we constantly hear about, but which I'm extremely skeptical that it will ever come. And I have to say, I have deep moral issues with this. It seems to me a deeply unethical thing to do. I would have thought the better thing to do is to talk peace, to negotiate. But all of these emphatic statements from the Ukrainians about how they're going to recapture all the territory, about how they're going to battle on until victory, until all of this territory is recaptured, until the deputy chief of Ukraine's military intelligence said that all the areas of Ukraine, including Crimea, are once again back under Ukrainian control. I mean, talking in this way, what it seems to me it's intended to do is to rule out negotiations. It makes negotiations impossible, and at the same time guarantee ever heavier losses. Now, I've already talked at length about the economic crisis in the West, which is deepening. There's been more news since I last made my last video about that. There's been no more news on that front. I'm not going to discuss that in this video. But more losses by the West, more losses of territory by Ukraine, more men killed, all to sustain a narrative of victory, to uphold a position of no negotiations, a narrative which is false, or so it seems to me, and a stance of no negotiations which looks to me utterly misguided. Truly, this looks like a war which is being fought to the last Ukrainian. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs on this channel and also on the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And remember, you can also find us on other platforms. You can join us on Locals, where we publish lots of exclusive content and where I do my live streams exclusively every Wednesday. And you can also find us on other platforms too, on Rumble and SuperU and ODYSEE and others. And of course, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop. I've got my magic mug with the US flag, still celebrating the 4th of July. And you can also support us by ticking the like button and subscribing to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.